This is the Darcy Giroux Podcast, episode 46. Today, my guest is Clayton Reeder. We're going to be talking about liberalism, democracy, Donald Trump, and the decline of empire. Clayton Reeder, welcome back to the Darcy Giroux Podcast. How are things?
Pretty well. It's nice to be with you again on Canada's number one libertarian podcast.
Yeah, Canada's number one libertarian podcast that tends to disappear for 6 or 8 months at a time. But we're back now.
Well, absence. What do they say? Absence makes the heart grow fonder.
Yeah, that's exactly
You,
right.
you don't want to be in everyone's face like with 3 podcast episodes a day or something.
No, you gotta leave them hanging. You gotta make them wanting more, right?
Do you ever like look at some of like on YouTube and stuff, like people doing 3 and 4 hour live streams every day? And I think like who watches it? Like who has the time? I guess maybe if they drive around a lot and they're listening to things, but I mean there's a lot of content. So you want to remain somewhat rare, so it's like extra good when you come out.
Oh, for sure. I think there are people who, like I look at my parents' generation and they just have the TV on in the background all the time. And I think for some people, maybe, that's what happens. Those live streams, they might catch an interesting anecdote out of it here and there. But for the most part,
Oh yeah,
it's
yeah.
just background noise. It's just,
That's interesting. I never really thought of it that way, but my mother does the same thing. She's got basically the news on, like the 24-hour kind of cable news stuff on all day long.
yeah.
And yeah, sometimes she just pays attention and other times she doesn't, but it's sort of like elevator music or something.
Yeah, it's just drowning out reality, I think. Okay, so we're not. It's not like we're fresh off of our capitalism and morality Calgary event last year, but we haven't got together to discuss, a few of the things that came out in your talk, and you're going to be speaking, next year at Jayant's event in Vancouver, and again at ours in Calgary. So, first of all, you're always kind of shitting on liberalism, right? So, I mean, I think one and not even just modern liberalism, because even in libertarian circles, there's people who strongly defend the Enlightenment and the kind of the that as the building blocks for the modern world. But your point is always, and you're not the only one to make this, of course, but that kind of the flaw, the problems we're seeing with modern liberalism or like liberal parties, the seeds for that were really planted at the beginning in classical liberalism and in the Enlightenment. Is that correct?
I guess so. I mean, this is just stuff I've been really grappling with in the last several years, even actually I'd say, decades plus, because a lot of it goes back to more fundamental critiques that I read earlier in my guys like Rothbard and Hoppe. And part of it seems sort of straightforward. Say the way Hoppe puts it, like there's a couple really good essays in Democracy, the God That Failed about the critical error of classical liberalism, and it goes deeper beyond that. But as a starting point, you can kind of think about how, like if we set up a constitution, or we set up a set of institutions that are going to basically arrange society in a certain way, or set up some kind of ground rules for society in which to operate. That sounds okay. There's a few issues that obviously come up. First of all, I mean, Um, the put aside like kind of the Hoppian argument for a second about just some of the errors within the Constitution itself about how from like a really hardcore Rothbardian perspective basically establishes a monopolist with the power to tax, and then you get a lot of bad things that flow out of that. But even more than that, think about what it means to like create a constitution, or before you get to that, think about what it means to like have a constitution. So it's not something that enforces itself. There's no like magical enforcement mechanism. It requires people. And then you think like, okay, so if the people need this, they need the interpretation of it. And it's like, okay, who's going to be doing the interpretation? But then step back a little bit, because I mean, obviously, we've all seen very interesting interpretations of, say, like Canadian law that might seem almost libertarianish, or American law that might seem almost libertarianish, and then it can kind of get twisted into other purposes, like, um, you know, equal rights for all or whatever. But you think so? We have a constitution. Or laws, or like the idea of the rule of law, which classical liberalism and even libertarianism is really big on, like an approach to justice or rights that is applied to everyone. You think like, where does that come from? Because a constitution itself has to be the product of a people that like understood the world a certain way, and so they kind of distill that idea of arranging society into like a legal document that's foundational, like a constitution or something. And you say, okay, well, now we've put the rule of law on paper, and that's kind of how we're going to govern our society. But eventually, you're going to move beyond the ability to, like, the background that provides, I guess, the virtuous background that produced that rule of law in the first place. What happens once you start to lose that? Because again, it's not like a self-rejuvenating or self-enforcing thing. It requires people who believe in that, people who like stake their lives in a sense on that. And so if liberalism has kind of this just neutral set of institutions in theory in which people operate, but it doesn't have the ability to create the people who will continue to uphold the values that led to the notion of the rule of law or rights, or however you want to put it. It it won't maintain itself. And then I think that's where you kind of get to this situation now where it's like, oh, well, we had the Constitution that was supposed to limit the government. Why didn't it limit the government? Can't you just limit the government harder, please, Constitution? You can't software update, or it's not like it's the product of something. And of course, libertarians or liberals or social scientists, it's obviously true that the way institutions are set up is going to influence the way individuals act and behave, but also obviously the way the individuals are is going to influence the way the institutions act and behave. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing here in the breakdown of maybe what you'd call the liberal order. The idea that you can just maintain this and not have other forces kind of come into play that will undermine it and degrade the rights or the protections of people's property or people's ability to, live freely, so to speak. Because I think in the modern era, like what we call maybe the progressive or universalist leftism, post-Marxist leftism that we have, it's really subverted a lot of what we would think of as liberal values. And in some ways, they might not see themselves as totally distinct from liberalism, like, equality and freedom for all. Like, who's going to disagree with that in a certain sense? But it's like the neutral liberal institution has left these openings for non-liberal ideas to undermine what makes the liberal society possible.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a little all over the place, but that's one of the things I'm kind of trying to think of and wrap my head around, and like, how we get here and what do you do now? And but really, like, why does a society work at all, and why do we have rule of law at all? And I think ultimately, um it comes from the way people are, and I don't think people are that way anymore. Like, even if you think of like a hardcore classical liberal like John Locke, the people who call themselves classical liberals now, like say, I don't know who's an example of.
Ugh. There aren't a lot of good strict adherents to like the classical liberal doctrine.
Because
Um,
a lot of people who would identify themselves as a classical liberal now, they're very sort of left in a lot of respects, but they don't really like a lot of aspects of the modern leftism. So they kind of shift into this classical liberal category. But I think if you thought of somebody like a John Locke, who is sort of like the epitome of the historical classical liberal idea in a lot of ways in people's minds, I think he'd throw a lot of these people like in a hole in like the woods somewhere, because he'd think they were just the worst people ever. And it's partly because, the kind of ideas or the formation of a person in John Locke, that leads up to uh, systems and institutions that we have. Like, a lot of that's just not there anymore.
yeah. Yeah, right. So, I don't think it was, to say that your comments are all over the place. I don't think that is. I think you're trying to figure something out here. And so, if we break it down a little bit, like, let's start maybe at the beginning, like with rational individualism. I mean, what was it that Locke was actually talking about when he talked about, um, rational individualism, and then how is that, been interpreted or co-opted by, people with maybe other political, they're looking for the means to exploit something like Locke's idea on rational individualism, right?
Well, um, let's see. I mean, the what was I going to say? The So a guy like Locke, um, and I'm a big John Locke fan. I think he's pretty hardcore. Not so much his like his empiricism, but his political philosophy I think is pretty interesting. And again, he's somewhat distinct from a more modern idea of classical liberalism, because he's a pretty hardcore guy. He has a there's any guy who's arguing for the justification of tyrannicide in his book is a pretty hardcore dude. I just like the word tyrannicide. Are we gonna get demonetized? Do we have to edit that part out?
Yeah, don't worry
Are
about
you
this
allowed to
show.
use the word
Yeah,
tyrannicide on the internet?
yeah, you have to get monetized first before you can get demonetized.
Okay, well, putting aside the tyrannicide discussion, um, the like think of it this way: a guy like John Locke and maybe kind of people in his world, liberty was a big deal. Liberty was important, kind of the way we think of liberty, like private property rights in that sort of sense. Not like just, do whatever you want, and uh, maybe a more immature kind of like libertinism. But um, one of the bitter pills I've had to swallow, and I'm interested actually in your thoughts on this too. But one of the bitter pills I've had to swallow is, guys like John Locke, or there's these traditions of people who wanted liberty, and liberty was a value to them. And now I feel like I've woken up to this idea that most people don't really want liberty at all. Liberty is kind of subordinated to the idea of like safety or whatever, security. And the mob, I guess, is never really the friend of liberty as Colonel Ledeen would say. Like he said, liberty was always an aristocratic value. And I think like, well, that's tough because from a libertarian perspective and from even the Hoppian perspective, where you think like ideas shape history and you want sort of a mass movement of people who want liberty in order to change society in a good direction. I'm like, how is that even supposed to work? Because people nowadays, like look at Canada, people do not really want liberty. There's not, maybe a few people do. And maybe some people sometimes say they like that idea, but it's not like the way you and I think of it. And honestly, I think it's such a minority position that um, it's a real problem when that as a value has been degraded so heavily. And especially you see it in the virus panic and multiple other aspects where liberty is basically just off the table as a consideration to whatever other set of priorities come into effect. So what do you think? Like, do people want liberty? Or is that only just something that only the tiniest minority ever will ever like put above other things?
Um, well, I think there's kind of two things there for myself that I mean, the one like as far as the aristocratic idea of freedom and liberty, I mean, this is where, I tend to cite, I mean, Hoppe has commented on this, and I might have even got this thought from him, but, he tended to side a lot more with the classical anarchists on some stuff, which was, that, where aristocracy espoused the freedom of noble men. Anarchy has always espoused the nobility of free men, and I think in liberalism there's something missing in there's something that kind of negates that equation, which is that kind of an overconfidence in human progress, right? Like if
Oh yeah.
like the belief that this kind of blind faith that progress, whether it's technological or political or whatever it is, progress of any kind leads to you know um, some sort of moral high ground, when in fact it's a lot of times the opposite, right?
Yeah, good old Whig theory of history that we're always like climbing and ascending and progressing to
Mm-hmm.
better states of being, or um, the that's one of the things too. Like, I don't feel like we've really progressed in a lot of ways, like in the last, I don't know, 100 years. um, Even technology is kind of like, we've got iPhones and we've got all these things, but I don't know, has there been anything really as crazy as like airplanes or indoor plumbing or
Yeah. Well, yeah,
and
on that front, I mean, I've made this comment before. I mean, like me and you could have recorded a conversation over the telephone 100 years ago. That's basically all we're doing right now.
yeah, this is a glorified telephone call.
Well, exactly, right?
The Yeah, so I mean, one thing, and this I talked about this a bit in the what would have been the 2023 capitalism and morality, and this is something that I think the left kind of understood. Like, if you want society to be a certain way, you have to kind of configure the people to value certain things, and liberalism itself kind of has sort of a hands-off approach to that. It's like we can have this neutral set of institutions that will just kind of let people work out their differences and work peacefully together. But um, the again, without people themselves being a certain way, those institutions will not function in that capacity. And instead, you will get that void kind of plugged with something. Like there will never be a neutral institution. I think that's one of the critical flaws of the sort of liberal order that we've been dealing with, and especially is kind of coming to a head in a lot of different kind of political stuff that's happened in the last few decades, especially in recent years. But the left has been very effective, very powerful in terms of shaping the way people think and therefore shaping the way those institutions operate. Like, look at the universities, look at the bureaucracies or the civil service or the media and all these things. Like, they didn't need to install like the leftist king or whatever. They basically took control of most of the power nodes by installing a certain kind of set of values into them through people, and that's deals with education and just kind of the way, whether it's propaganda or education or however you want to think of it as being done. Like, people don't really think in terms of the principles, again, that would make the classical liberal limited state rule of law kind of work. Now it's like real politics. It's like a power play over institutions. It's a um I don't know, but that's part of the key. Like, one of the issues is there's no real way for classical liberalism to sustain itself by its own program. Like, something else has to fill that void. So maybe that's not to say classical liberalism as an idea is inherently broken, but it needs like an extra piece in order to like make it work. Maybe that doesn't mean it's broken. I don't know, but um, the left, I think, figured out that a neutral institution can never really truly be a neutral institution. And then you get into the whole thing, like, if one side is playing as if the institutions are neutral and the other side is playing as if they are not, and they have to be controlled and they have to be influenced, and like the underlying people and influences within those institutions do actually matter and are really the deciding force in a lot of case. That first side that operates under the illusion of the neutral liberal paradigm, they're always going to get crushed by the ones that are like playing the game at a higher real political level.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. So I guess, one thing that, part like kind of the more libertarian approach to this is, kind of this is a problem of scale sometimes too, like with like the ideas of smaller polities or decentralization, because what you end up like these what you end up having is like these enlightenment ideals and these ideas of universal rights and equality. There's challenges in applying them to like larger and more diverse and complex groups, and then what you have is like a society that can't or you have like a dependence on institutions um without having that kind of personal moral responsibility, right?
Yeah, that's a thing too. I've been thinking a lot about um, the obviously, if you break it down to like a really small social unit, like a family or something, there's a whole different level of uh, um, kind of bi-directional responsibilities and relationships and accountability involved. And even though you wouldn't think of a family like, you know, like a household's not like libertarian in a political sense, because there's usually like a boss or there's sort of a sense of, I don't know, you know what I mean. But there's also like a sort of virtue required that can be more mutually reinforced in like the small community. Um, once you turn into like the big super state or the big modern nation state, sometimes with all kinds of like very conflicting groups just jammed in together, um, I think that kind of respect and sense of responsibility really breaks down and turns it into a battle for all the loot, like all the booty of the conquest. Like, how can you use the system to enrich yourself? Because if I don't get it, the other guy's going to get it, and that's not really a healthy approach to society. That's like basically the zero sum game attitude, and it's I don't know. That's a tough one because
Okay, so I guess like part of what I'm getting at is the reciprocal relationship between people and society. And it becomes it becomes larger, and or as like a state becomes larger and larger, it becomes more complicated. It becomes something where to appease even a majority of people, there's not a lot of there's not a lot of leeway there. It's a pretty narrow avenue for even conversations or thought, right? And there's kind of a in a functioning society, there's a necessity for individuals to embody and promote moral the moral principles of that society. And when the society is too big and diverse, that's basically impossible.
yeah, I guess like uh, there's something about democracy that I think really brings out the worst in people and really puts each other at or people at each other's throats. And I don't know, like think of Singapore. Like it's a diverse society, but it's not democratic the same way we think of like Canada. Um, it's like it basically doesn't have tolerance for people trying to rip everyone off. Like they basically are forced to cooperate in a sense. And I guess that requires like a certain amount of mm, ruling. Like it takes a certain amount of strength in the ruling structure to kind of hold a society like that together. But in that case, it's more of like a force issue. There's other ways like a diverse society could operate together, and it has to be again like a unified share of or unified shared values that can like kind of bring people together. Like if you think about really ancient societies, they didn't really think of race or people groups the way we do. For example, they would think about it more um like say ritual participation, like we all worship the same gods and we do the same rituals and we are the same people group, like we share the same story. And that's something that doesn't really happen in like the modern democracy or the modern multicultural vision, where it's like everyone kind of has their own story, but we're all going to still live together under the same political system. And there's just a misalignment. Again, it turns into that thing where, well, we have to use the system to get that group because otherwise they're going to have more resources than us, and we don't want that. Um, like the whole, you can almost see a little bit of plausibility sometimes in the idea that oh, you need to have like a society can only be successful if it only has like one group in it. Like you get on sometimes the right wing sort of like ethno nationalist kind of idea. They say like, oh, well, society doesn't work unless everyone's basically the same. It's like, I mean, that's you can see a certain plausibility in that sense, but it's like, what does it mean to be the same? Because like if you think of just ethnicity, I have very little in common with like Eastern Canadians, I would say, in a lot of ways. Like I'm a whitey in Western Canada. I don't really share a lot of values with a lot of other, like, say, I don't know, whitey Canadians in Quebec or something. Like, at least it doesn't seem like it. But then even if you think of like Japan, and a lot of people point to Japan, like look how functional it is. Look how wonderful Japan is. Very homogenous society, and it's very clean, and there's not a lot of crime, and everyone's nice to each other, and the subways are so clean. Oh, wonderful! But even that, and this probably takes us into like a different topic that's sort of like maybe not a useful rabbit trail, but Japan has not escaped the modern malaise. Like Japan has not escaped like the curse of modernity. It seems like a depressed society in a lot of ways, just like say Canada or America is with all these like diverse populations together. So there's something weird going on that's deeper there too, and it's like, and maybe that ties into this whole thing. Like no one's got the fire in their belly to preserve their society or like fight for it or fight for virtue or to live the good life, because it's been all outsourced to these bureaucracies and these other institutions. Not even other institutions, in a lot of ways it's one institution. It's like the modern state is the institution that's supposed to cover every part of life, and you're just supposed to do your thing. But now what do people have to do? There's nothing really for them to fight for, not like violent wise, but like what are they improving themselves for? What are they like what institution are they trying to make better, or as opposed to just what loot are they trying to secure with one political mechanism or another?
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
even remember what the initial question about that was, but I
Well,
just got
but
thinking about that because I think about the Japan thing, and sometimes people say like, "Oh, if we were just more like Japan, we'd have such a great society." It's like I don't think that's correct. Like they might be more homogenous, or at least I don't know. It seems that way to the outside observer, but I don't think they've solved the basic problem of like the modern social democracy. In a lot of ways, they've imported like the Western institutions. As Jay Ont would say,
it showed
one of
up.
the reasons Japan works, one of the reasons Japan works at all is because basically they kind of like adopted a lot of what's basically functional about the West,
Yeah.
and they kind of just did it their own way, and it more or less works okay. But
It got
at the
delivered.
same
It got
time,
delivered there with the nukes.
yeah, exporting democracy.
Yeah.
We'll bomb you into freedom.
Yeah. I get so,
And some
but
people would say, hey, it worked. And I don't
yeah.
know, maybe it didn't. Maybe it was just, maybe, as always, it always looks like a lot of bad ideas work at first, and then you start to see the problems
Oh,
maybe
for
way
sure.
down the line.
For sure. As far as the Malays in Japan, I have some friends who live in Japan, at least part of the time, and they talk about the rampant alcoholism and depression, and kind of again the economic turmoil. The guys who are um, sleeping on park benches in their three-piece suits and bathing in public bathrooms to go to their office job the next day, that sort of thing, which is just a really funny. You see a little bit of that here too, but it's just a strange thing. And then to your point, what we were originally talking about, I mean, my comment was that it seems to me like a problem of scale. If you talk about Singapore, I mean, Singapore's not much bigger than, I mean, it might be population wise the size of like British Columbia. I think it might be 6 million people or something. I'm not even sure where we're at in Alberta, maybe close to 5. So I mean, some of that to me is a problem of scale, but maybe not. And then I think like one of the things you keep touching on is kind of like this idea of individual agency and institutions, and from the modern liberal or even from the classical liberal perspective, in some sense, there's a reliance on these institutions to educate and regulate and enforce norms. And um, again, to like what I was saying earlier, like the reciprocal idea of it has to be a kind of a positive feedback loop instead of a negative feedback loop, right? And um, and then of course you risk fostering this type of dependence on these eroding institutions, right? So once the institutions start to turn south, or you're not putting the care to take care of them, it becomes like this negative feedback loop.
Hmm, that's really interesting. Because I'm thinking a lot about like what is the precondition for having like a free society, and I think it, a lot of it always comes back to this that little book, Are We Good Enough for Liberty, right? And it's like such a simple little book, and it's like it's so I've basically that book has haunted me for 20 years, or when did I first read it? Maybe 15 years ago. It was quite a while back. But are we good enough for liberty? And in a way here, like there's no positive feedback for virtue in our society, I think, in a lot of ways. Like you are rewarded. Look at all the scandals in Ottawa right now, where it's like you're rewarded for basically being a scumbag, sometimes to the tune of millions of dollars. Or think if you're like a productive, responsible person, you're punished. Like they will suck the blood out of you for the sake of whatever, the cronies, the scumbags in the government, the broadly speaking, the parasite class. I don't want to dunk too much on the welfare bums necessarily, but that's a factor too. But they get a relatively modest slice of all the loot that goes to the real low lifes in society. And this is kind of interesting because there should be, like, in a functional world or a functional society, there should be a reward for being virtuous, like living the good life in maybe the Aristotelian sense or something like that. Do you feel like there's a reward? I mean, there is obviously, like in your family and your personal life and all that, but in a lot of ways, you're punished, like kind of almost to the extent. Doesn't mean it ruins your life entirely, but there is a scale of punishment that comes with success or doing the right thing. Like the society, in a lot of ways, rewards the moocher, the bum, the crony, the socialist, the criminal, like all these things. It's very upside down. It's very backwards, and it was never supposed to really work that way. Like a good society should basically in some way reward people for doing the right thing, barring misfortune and things which we would think, sometimes that's an injustice. Like say you do everything right in your life, you're very responsible, you get married, you have a wholesome family, and say you get really sick near the end of your life, and then you're living in a shack for the last years of your life in total poverty because just everything crumbled around you. And, we'd say that's pretty unfair. That sucks. But in general, we would want a society that rewards people. And I don't think we do. I think that's part of the corruption or the inversion of the social democracy. Like it rewards the non-productive, it rewards the non-virtuous. And again, how in a society that does that, how can you sustain proper institutions, or how do you sustain rule of law, or how do you sustain like a sense or passion for justice when justice is an impediment to like actually getting a piece of the loot?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm gonna take a page right out of your book and say, like, doesn't Jesus explain that to us? Like, isn't this part of our suffering? Isn't that part of what the Bible says?
Yeah, well, definitely, there's no way out of suffering. And as C.S. Lewis says, you either get your choices are tragedy or damnation. And of those choices, I'll pick the tragedy rather than the damnation. But no, but yeah, I mean, like, I'm not a utopian kind of guy. Like, I always know there's going to be, there's no way out of some people who want to rip you off and exploit you and unfairness and all that. And you just kind of do your best in the world. And, it is kind of funny. Like, if you do the right thing most of the time, things will be okay most of the time, not always. And if you do the wrong thing most of the time, well, a lot of times you're going to have problems too. But we would hope the institutions are set up in a way to like encourage or motivate the good life. And I think social democracy really elevates like the ugly or the degenerate, or you basically end up subsidizing uh, the worst parts of humanity in a lot of ways. And Hoppe talks about that. One of his best essays, I think, is, I forget the title, but I think it was posted on LRC at one point under the title of Down with Democracy, which was a very provocative title back in the day, because that's like back in 2001 or something when that book came out. Um, and he just takes a very simple law of economics that if you subsidize something, you're going to get more of it. And he says democracy subsidizes like the worst people. And in a way, it's not like a cutting edge thought or anything. It's almost on the same continuity as Hayek's idea that, to paraphrase, pardon my language, but shit floats, like the worst rise to the top in social democracy. That's road to serfdom kind of idea. So what have we done? Like what have we created? Like a society that rewards the worst people and makes the best people like work that much harder and suffer that much more. It seems kind of backwards and perverse. And but like you think about the, say, the American founders or something, like they never just thought it would be an automatic self maintaining process. Like they knew that this is a society that's the result of certain people with certain values, and it needs certain people and certain values in order to maintain that society. And we've kind of slipped away from that. Now the power structure is really evolved and different. And I think part of that malaise, we said, like, we don't really care, or we don't feel like we should care to um, do what needs to be done, because so much of it has been outsourced to the state. And in outsourcing it to the state, in a lot of ways, we've outsourced it to the worst people in the world. Like, look at the people who love to get government jobs and stuff, or the soft power part of that, which is the media and the universities and things, like usually not friends of liberty in the sense that we would think.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, the first of all, yeah, the one thing sticks out for me. I mean, I think there's a number of great Hoppe essays where he like makes the point about, um, the subsidization thing. I mean, even through something as simple as socialized healthcare, you are subsidizing unhealthy habits, because people will be able to, live kind of an unhealthy lifestyle and not have to pay for the repercussions of it through socialized healthcare, right? And of course, he's famous for his critiques of democracy. Some people, I mean, in some sense, I think there are, you know, uh, and don't get me wrong, I love Hoppe, but I mean, he is sometimes accused of like pearl clutching and whatnot, and I think there is a little bit of that, but only enough that makes for kind of an entertaining read. But the reality is there are flaws in democracy that aren't acknowledged enough, and there's definitely a structural weakness that's kind of like there's a vulnerability to manipulation and very short term thinking in democracy, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting how, well, Hoppe really highlighted a lot of these issues for me, but he wasn't necessarily like original. A lot of that stuff was like old classical liberal critiques of democracy, because we've forgotten a lot of these people. Colonel Ladine's my favorite example, but there was a lot of like classical liberal monarchists who hated democracy because they said, look, I've got liberal values. Democracy is not going to protect those liberal values, like classical liberalism, the way we kind of think of it. And I think there's a lot to that.
Well, I think
Colonel Ladine was in.
I think Hoppe's point, like in the Democracy, the God that failed, one of the big points I took out of that book was that, I mean, this was a commonplace opinion, before the First World War, basically, right? I mean, this was and then after, you kind of had all the great houses of Europe disappear and turn into these nation states. I mean, that whole idea that a monarchy or a private city or anything like that is capable of protecting your freedoms better than a nation state. I mean, that disappeared after that, after the First World War.
Yeah, it's interesting that democracy historically, and we often put like democracy and liberalism together as like this package deal, and that's historically not really the case, at least the way it was understood. And democracy on itself was basically considered the worst form of government for like thousands and thousands of years, going back to Plato and Aristotle. It was only very recently in history that democracy got like this good reputation, sort of, and sometimes not even clear why. Like David Gordon had a good essay back in the day called like "What is the argument for democracy?" He's like the philosophy reviewer guy at the Mises Institute.
Yep.
I think he's still there. And he basically just went through all the arguments, and it's like there's not really like any real arguments for it in a way. It's almost just kind of assumed by default, and it kind of comes from that super annoying thing like, well, it's the worst form of government rather than all the others. And it's like, well, should we really take that for granted? Maybe that's not right, but now I think now I wonder if it's kind of an interesting thing that's happening where democracy is kind of getting a bit of a re-examination, because it's sort of a fake idea in a lot of ways, because basically you end up with an oligarchy of sorts, and basically just a different set of elites with a veneer of like a democratic system. But it's really like the elites or the institution, like the bureaucracies and stuff that kind of run things, and the systems that produce those managers, like in the managerial system, I guess you could say. And now I wonder if it's maybe evolving in a sense that it's like democracy isn't a system that like it has sort of a fakeness to it that I think people perceive more now. And I think we're seeing a little more backlash against the idea of the current elites that operate things. But if you go to Mises, like the way he talked about democracy, he said he didn't think of it as just majority rule and such. There's always kind of like these different ideas that get rolled up into it. But he said it was like self-rule, self-determination, or something like that, right? And those sound good, but democracy in our sense really in practice means like rule by a certain oligarchy that actually controls like the bureaucracies. Look at the states. Like, remember Biden? Remember Joe Biden?
No, I don't.
Okay, so he was a president for a few years, and he was basically like a senile old man. And he wasn't, he was voted in, but he wasn't really running anything.
Yeah.
And then when they decided he was too demented to run for a re-election campaign, apparently he was not too demented to remain as like the functional president. But we all know like he wasn't really the guy. Like there's other things that run everything.
Yeah.
And so it's like people have said for so long, like, doesn't matter who you vote for because the system doesn't really care. Like it's just going to operate on its own. It's going to push its priorities, push its values, and the figurehead or the character at the top of the letterhead, or the image of the government, like he's just kind of a cartoon character almost.
Mm-hmm. Well, it ties into it ties into your argument about democracy in a way. Like this is where like demagoguery comes from, right? There's these these emotional appeals and this divisive divisive rhetoric that kind of replaces, like proper or, uh, proper governance or however you want to put it. And then you end up with somebody like Joe Biden, and it's kind of, and then you 4 years later you see the polls again, and what you've really seen is like the erosion in trust of democratic institutions.
which I think is kind of a good thing. But
No,
I
oh,
worry
absolutely.
about.
But I mean, is that not what like? If we, I mean, we're not that far removed from this last election, and Trump hasn't been sworn in yet. But I mean, to me, that's really what I saw more than anything. It was, you saw that what year are we talking about? Was it 2020? I guess you saw kind of like I say all the rhetoric and stuff, and this all this nonsense that was um, appealing to people on an emotional level that basically replaced, substantive government. And now the next election cycle, you just see this crazy, this erosion in trust. Like you see like people. This is the biggest protest vote of all time, and it's not only against Joe Biden or for Trump. It seems to me like this is a big fu to the system in general.
Yeah, people are. It's kind of interesting the evolving opinions about the system or the ruling class or the expert class or however you want to define that. It's um, so the let's see in a lot of ways these groups have been very severely discredited by just either stupid or crazy or wrong things that they've said. Like, remember when we were told inflation wouldn't be a problem in the virus panic when they printed a bunch of money? Or remember being told like all these kind of crazy things, like we can centrally plan the climate or we can eliminate viruses because we'll centrally plan public health and all these kind of crazy things. And it's it's just interesting how far the system has stretched itself to assert its domination over these things that you can't dominate. And it's like that hubris that it's eventually you're gonna uh, fall and embarrass yourself the more you reach beyond your capabilities. And the the modern system with these kind of really grandiose ideas about reshaping reality, almost like we can change the way people think so they don't have any bad ideas, or we can eliminate the viruses, control the temperature on the world, all these things, and like none of them really work. But it's there's something about a I wonder if it ties into the whole virtue thing, like just not understanding your limits and like being so arrogant or prideful that you think you can basically reshape reality. Because I think part of democracy and the sort of the way the regimes work that we live under, they work like that. Like they really encourage people to make these totally preposterous totalitarian schemes to dominate things. And any sane normal person like just wouldn't think that way. But the like with the I've been thinking about like what the whole Trump thing means, and I don't think Trump's like some guy who's going to save the world or anything, or fix the system. Like I just don't think it works that way, and or if it does, I don't think he's the guy who does that. But I'm still trying to understand like what the whole Trump thing means and what it means for like a sense of um, liberty in the future or liberty now or relative liberty, because it's all relative compared to what. And I think like part of what's going on is um, I don't know. There's this weird sort of shift that's almost happening, and among Trump voters, like everyone's way more hardcore than Trump. Like Trump's like this '90s New York style Democrat, and a lot of his, his fans are not that. They're more like kind of hardcore, and Trump in kind of this being part of this more general thrust, like he's sort of the tip of the spear as the FU to the expert class or the managerial class that has failed in so many regards. But because of what kind of goes with that, because it's not so much Trump I'm interested in. It's like more the people who support Trump for different reasons that I really find interesting. And I think part of what they've seen, especially with basically kind of the inability of Trump to do much in his first term, as far as like that has really woken people up to this idea that they need to take some responsibility. Like no one's coming to save you. And even if you get your guy in there, your Trump guy in there or whatever, he's the level of like power and commitment that's required to really like change the way things are. Um, it it's not there. It's not there in that person. But that makes people then kind of like turn inwards a bit or turn to their communities and things and be like, well, what can we do to improve our lives, like become better people, contribute to our communities? Because we can't save ourselves with these democratic options, or like even if we get some crazy wild man like Trump, and even if say somebody has a lot of faith in that kind of idea, like we just need to vote for the right guy and he'll fire all the bad guys and turn the system around, or at least rejig it so it's much better in some way. um, I think it's part of this idea that like Trump's kind of the FU, but it's not really the solution that most people see. Like it's different versus 2016. Like now, because Trump lost and Trump's sort of the symbol, but people are thinking like they have to take a little more responsibility for themselves and what um and part of it is because the political institutions have become like kind of crazy and discredited and weaker in a lot of ways, especially with the way the media has changed and like Elon taking over Twitter. Doesn't matter. Like you, people can be haters or lovers of Elon, like big fan, but it's important to have that cultural node where it's part of the media's breakdown of their control of things. And so just part of this grand scope of what's happening, I think there is a lot of people like reconsidering the way they live in the social democracy, and that politics isn't the solution. Politics is kind of like derived from something else that's morally prior to just voting and who's in the government and stuff. So yeah, something really kind of interesting is going on, especially on the right side of the equation. I think some people on the left are starting to see this too, but they're a little more attached to the way things work now because they have more of those cultural nodes under their influence, whereas the right really does not. And so they're forced to reconsider things in a different way. But hey, sorry, my cat's just showed up and he's causing trouble. But yeah, I think something really interesting is happening because we're kind of in the decline of the empire. Trump is like the product of an empire in decline. You wouldn't get like a Trump guy. You wouldn't notice these problems. Like you wouldn't be caring if everything was going really well. But because different aspects of institutions and functionality in society are degrading and becoming worse, now we're noticing things. And with that becomes that sense that like if you don't have power, like if you're living in a system that is controlled by other people, then it really changes like what you feel like you have to do to be in society. And I think that that's one of the most interesting things about what's going on. There's this, it's not quite, are we good enough for liberty? Like that's not the question. Because again, as I was saying earlier, I don't think most people want liberty, or at least they don't think they want liberty or whatever. But they're focused more on themselves and their families and their communities and what they need to do to like just kind of be good people in that world. sometimes people just operate automatically in that way. But now I think we're thinking about it more explicitly, and people are thinking more about religion, or like how they can be productive, or how they can be virtuous. And you might see some of these things, like it's very kind of all over the place, but you sort of correlate different things that you observe, and it seems to be happening. Or maybe I'm just overanalyzing it or misinterpreting it, but there seems to be some transformation that's going down. And I don't really get it. Trump is part of it, not in the sense that like he's good or bad. He's just a product of this transformation that's happening. Like he's a result of it, but he's also kind of a cause of it. So he's just like this very complex, interesting political character. Not really like that he's like, oh, he's like great friend of liberty or something. It's not like that. It's just he's part of this like pivot point in empire, and all empires rise and fall, and you would only get a character like Trump in a certain state in the devolution of the empire that we're in right now.
Yeah. Well, I think, yeah, I think I'm not really sure, but what old Lou Rockwell says about it right now, but I'm pretty sure it would be something similar. But I haven't really read his thoughts on Trump recently. But it would be exactly that. Like he's a product of the decline of the empire. It's like, and in some ways, a cautionary tale. You know what I mean?
Yeah, because like it's so American, and it's so social democracy, like that you get this just kind of crazy character as president, not once but twice. But then also it's just interesting, like what does it say about, I mean, it's not like he won like 90% of the popular vote or something, like, but he won. And that in itself is interesting. Like, how did he not get absolutely wiped out? Because you had the entire thing during his first term where every institution, even the government that supposedly he's in charge of, was against him. And then they're trying to prosecute him, and they're trying to ruin him. They're suing him and all this stuff. They say all these crazy things about him, which, again, you don't have to be a Trump fan, but a lot of the things they say about Trump are just like absolutely insane. Like people who throw the word like Hitler and fascist around, like, have these people ever read books, like history books, or have they ever actually read like a book on the philosophy of fascism and stuff? Like Trump's a 90s New York Democrat. I think I said that a little earlier. This is not like, he's probably less right wing than Bill Clinton in 1992.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And look at all the people he's got. He's got Elon Musk. That's like a Democrat or former
they're all
Democrat.
former Democrats.
Tulsi Gabbard, or what's her name? Tulsi Gabbard.
Tulsi
She's
Gabbard,
a Democrat.
yeah.
She's not exactly like a hardcore right winger.
No.
And RFK Jr.
Multi-generational
not exactly
Democrat.
a hardcore right winger. So it's just, I don't know, it's weird. And very interesting though. And I think there's like maybe some ripple effects that are going to come out of it. But I think part of the importance of it is when people see that Trump can't really do what they want him to do, again, that forces them to like, well, let's think of ourselves. Let's think of our communities. Let's like, what can we do where voting doesn't really do anything, especially at the federal level? Like,
well, hopefully, but
local politics is kind of a different scene, but at the federal level, like, everyone wants their savior to just swoop in and fix everything and do what they want. And it's like, it doesn't really work that way. And you got some major issues.
Well, I'm just going to push back a bit there, because again, this is really the type of flaw you're talking about in democracy, because what ends up happening, and this happens every time, is that they're going to see Trump didn't do what he promised to do. And then there's a hard swing to the other political party. That historically is how politics works. Now, I like your optimism that people are thinking more that way and stuff, but if I can play the pessimist for a minute, that is probably what's going to happen in the next election. Is he's going to be so bogged down in bureaucracy, and I mean, he still needs I forget the numbers, but it's doubtful. Some of the stuff he's talking about passing. I mean, he's got so many of these his own Republicans that are old neocons or rhinos or whatever you want to call them, that are not going to vote with him on some of this stuff, and he's not going to be able to push some of it through. Like when he says he's going to abolish the Department of Education, I'd love to see that. Pretty unrealistic that he's going to be able to get that through. And then when people say, you know, when the left or the Democrats or whoever is able to say, look, he not only was this a bad idea, it was so unpopular that he couldn't get it through. What we need is proper reform of this institution and to spend this much more money on it. And then people are going to vote for that.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways you're probably correct. Other than, I mean, that's sort of the normal kind of back and forth that happens. And I wonder if, yeah, maybe I'm overthinking it or overstating it, that kind of this like change in people's mindsets, or online you'll hear people talk about the vibe shift, and there's just weird ways people are talking about that, things that I've never heard them talk about before. But as to the point of like, can Trump deliver the goods? Like, say you're a big Trump guy and you want him to do the things he says he would like to do, and from my perspective, it's like kind of irrelevant in a sense. Policy is almost like not the issue at this stage. It's almost like more of a cultural or aesthetic transformation, or like just a different way of thinking. Like a lot of the policy stuff that he can't or would never change is just kind of a given. Like he's not going to like fix the deficit or something like that, you know. But I wonder if there's something about like the nature of Trump as a character who, because he's sort of like this kind of like clown character at the late stage of an empire that's really getting kind of decadent and decrepit. I wonder if the fact that he fails does mean something more. Like when people see that, and maybe he gets caught with holding the bag of, you know, a true decline. Like maybe instead of promising like all this great economic stuff, maybe he gets caught holding the bag of like really bad things that happen, like maybe some new big unwinnable war situation or some major economic problem, and he's caught holding that. And then they see, well, Trump couldn't fix it, and then the choice is like, well, do we switch to the other guys, or do we come to this sense that like you cannot fix it without some other option? And that's sort of the worry, I think, in some ways, because especially when there's this strand of kind of the post-Marxist leftist revolutionary kind of thinking of like turning everything upside down, and kind of like this chaos force. I worry that tends towards ultimately like this kind of orgy of bloodshed, and I don't really want a bunch of people killing each other in my country and stuff. But I wonder if people realize at some point that you can't fix it with, or not realize, but get the sense in their head that you can't like fix the problem or sort things out without some people killing each other. And I worry that's like a genuine problem that we might be moving towards in the next few decades. Hopefully I'm wrong about that, but part of it is like, well, if this guy can't fix it, or if our guy can't fix it, then what do we do? And then there's a fork in the road as well. Do we like kind of focus on ourselves and fix things, or do we have to go like kill the bad guys? And I also wonder if at some point, like, sort of the leftist oligarchy has to decide that, you know, they have to find some scapegoat, kill them, in the sense that like there's kind of like this purgation, and then they declare victory, and then moves into some next stage, because it's like the Girardian idea where a society kind of builds on the story of some bad thing that they had to kill in order to make the society possible, like scapegoating idea. I don't know. I just think there's like so much crazy stuff going on right now, and it all kind of ties together. Going back like way to where we started the conversation, it's like this paradox of liberalism tied to the decay of the Western social democracy, and then getting crazy characters like Trump and total like clowns and buffoons, and like Kamala Harris or Joe Biden, like most powerful empire in the world, and like that's your leader. It's not like what you I don't know. 1932 when FDR like did his inauguration, he basically became like king of the country. For better or worse, like he was a terrible leader, terrible ruler, did basically set America on like a very bad path. But the way he asserted power over the system, like you would have to have like the libertarian version of FDR. And I don't think that's even possible to like fix the institutions, because I just don't necessarily think it can work that way. You're always going to have different circulating groups of elites like in and out, but I don't know what's to come, and just there's so much crazy stuff happening. Trump's just kind of like the tip of the iceberg on it, but he's the, again, not really the cause of it. He's more the result of all these other kind of crazy things we're talking about, which is just the way sort of the internal logic of the liberal democracy of the West has gotten to this point, and now it has to deal with its problem one way or another. I don't know what that looks like, and I'm very interested in riding it out.
Well, don't put all the weight of the world on you figuring it out. Sometimes we just got to wait and see how it plays out also.
Yeah, I'm having so much fun. Like I have never been so, I wouldn't say optimistic, but I don't think I've ever been so interested in political stuff, but not in the normal way, not like following the individual headlines day by day, or like this scandal or that story or this policy debate and stuff. It's like something bigger. It's like an aesthetic thing that's transforming around us, and I am kind of seeing it bubble up in some places. I just cannot wait to see the next 5 or 10 years. I think it's going to be absolutely hilarious and tragic and awesome and absolutely epic.
Awesome. Okay, Clayton, thanks for coming on.
I don't even know what we talked about.
That was Clayton Reeder, co-organizer for the Capitalism and Morality Calgary Seminar. Thanks for listening. See you later.